Picture the 1970s. When you think of a country music legend from that era, who comes to mind? Probably a man in black, a rebel, an outlaw. You imagine long hair, denim jackets, and songs steeped in whiskey, rebellion, and hard-lived truths. It was the age of Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and Johnny Cash, men who waged a war against the polished Nashville establishment. Yet during this exact same period of turmoil, one of the most successful and consistent hitmakers in the entire genre was a man who was their polar opposite. He wore impeccably tailored suits. His voice was as smooth as silk. And his songs weren't about fighting the law. They were about the quiet, devastating politeness of saying goodbye. His name was Tommy Overstreet. And if that name only sparks a faint sense of recognition, you're not alone. He was a ghost on the charts, ever present, yet somehow invisible. But the true enigma of Tommy Overstreet, the secret that unlocks his entire life and career, isn't just his gentle sound in a rebellious time. It lies with another ghost, a much older one that haunted his every step. This wasn't the story of a man fighting the system. It was the story of a man fighting a shadow, the shadow of one of the biggest superstars the world had ever seen. To understand Tommy Overstreet, you first have to understand the man he could never escape, his cousin, the 1920s crooning legend, Gene Austin. This is the story of how that crushing legacy, that quiet, lifelong struggle for identity, accidentally created a sound that defined an era, gave voice to the unspoken heartaches of millions, and was then almost completely forgotten. His personal struggle for identity didn't happen in a vacuum. It unfolded against the backdrop of a fascinating and deeply conflicted moment in time, the late 1960s and early 1970s. America was a nation in upheaval. The psychedelic haze of the Summer of Love was giving way to the harsh realities of the Vietnam War, political assassinations, and a growing chasm between generations. And nowhere was this cultural tug-of-war more apparent than in the world of country music. For decades, country had been the music of the rural working class, defined by the raw twang of a steel guitar and the unvarnished stories of heartache and hardship. But by the late 60s, Nashville was changing. A new sound was emerging from the legendary studios of Music Row, a sound that aimed to smooth out country's rough edges. They called it the Nashville sound, and later, its more polished evolution, Countrypolitan. Producers like Billy Sherrill and Chet Atkins began swapping out fiddles for full orchestral string sections. They buried the honky-tonk piano under layers of lush background vocals. The goal was simple: crossover success. They wanted to create a version of country music that could feel just as at home on a pop station in Los Angeles as it did on a country station in Texas. This created a deep schism. On one side, you had the traditionalists and the burgeoning outlaw movement, artists like Waylon Jennings and Willie Nelson, who saw this slick new sound as a betrayal, a neutering of country music's raw, authentic soul. They fled Nashville for Austin, championing a grittier, more rebellious sound. But on the other side were artists who embraced the Countrypolitan ideal, people like Charlie Rich, Conway Twitty, and Tammy Wynette. They saw it not as a compromise, but as an evolution. They were creating sophisticated, emotionally resonant music for an adult audience, people who had outgrown rock and roll but still craved songs that spoke to their lives. This was the world that was waiting for Tommy Overstreet. It was a world of deep division where the very definition of country was up for debate. And into this fractured landscape walked a man whose entire life had been a quiet negotiation between two opposing worlds. Thomas Overstreet was born on September the 10th, 1937 in Oklahoma City, but his roots were firmly planted in the red dirt of Texas, where his family moved shortly after. His childhood was shaped by a force that would seem, on the surface, entirely at odds with the future he would choose, the church. His father was a preacher, and the Overstreet home was one of faith, scripture, and gospel hymns. This was his first exposure to the power of music, its ability to stir the soul, to offer comfort, and to tell a story. But the sacred music of the church was a world away from the secular sounds that were beginning to capture his young imagination. While his father preached from the pulpit, another more distant family member was preaching a different kind of gospel from the radio. This was the first and most formative shadow in Tommy's life, his cousin, Gene Austin. Now, for a modern audience, the name Gene Austin might not ring many bells, but in the 1920s and 30s, Gene Austin was not just a star, he was a supernova. He was one of the world's first crooners, a pioneering voice who sold an estimated 80 million records, a staggering number for the time. His 1928 recording of My Blue Heaven was one of the best-selling records in history, a cultural touchstone. Gene Austin was royalty. He lived a life of unimaginable fame and fortune. For young Tommy, Gene wasn't just a famous relative, he was a myth, a legend whose success seemed both intoxicating and impossibly distant. While Tommy was singing hymns in a Texas church, his cousin was a global phenomenon. This connection became the defining tension of his early life. It gave him a dream, a tangible link to a world of stardom, but it also saddled him with an immense, unspoken pressure. He wasn't just a kid with a guitar. He was Gene Austin's cousin. The expectation was always there, hanging in the air. As a teenager, Tommy began to gravitate towards the burgeoning sounds of rock and roll and pop music. He was captivated by Elvis Presley, by the energy and rebellion that was a world away from his father's sermons. He formed a band, Tommy Overstreet and the Echoes, and began playing in local clubs around Houston and Abilene. This was his training ground. Night after night, he learned how to command a stage, how to read a crowd, and how to sing the songs of love and loss that were the currency of the dimly lit bars and dance halls of West Texas. He even got to open for rockabilly legends like Carl Perkins and Gene Vincent. After high school and a stint in the U.S. Army, Tommy's ambition crystallized. He knew he had to get to the heart of the music business. He worked as a performer, a songwriter, and even a radio DJ, learning every facet of the industry. For a time, he managed a club in Austin, Texas, where he booked a struggling, long-haired songwriter who was just starting to make a name for himself, Willie Nelson. It's a fascinating footnote. These two future icons crossing paths, both on the verge of stardom, but destined for two completely different sides of the country music civil war. The real turning point came when he decided to make the pilgrimage to Nashville, but he didn't arrive as a wide-eyed hopeful with a guitar case and a dream. He came in through the side door. In 1967, he took a job not as a singer, but as a professional manager for Dot Records. This was an incredibly shrewd move. For 3 years, he wasn't the talent. He was the man who managed the talent. He learned the business from the inside out. He saw which songs got picked, how records were promoted, and what it took to build a career. He was patient. He was learning. He was waiting for his moment, and that moment came in a way that feels like pure Nashville folklore. The story goes that one of the label's top executives, Rick Cordell, overheard a demo tape that Tommy had recorded on his own time. He didn't know who was singing. He just heard a voice that was clear, strong, and full of emotion. He played it for the legendary producer Billy Sherrill, who famously asked, "Who is that? I want to sign him." When Ryan revealed it was their own promotions manager, the deal was done. After years of paying his dues, after years of living in the shadow of his famous cousin, Tommy Overstreet was finally getting his shot. He was 32 years old. His first few singles barely made a ripple. But then came 1971. Then came Gwen, Congratulations. The song was a masterpiece of emotional subtlety. It wasn't a tear-soaked ballad of betrayal or a bitter anthem of revenge. It was something far more relatable and far more painful. It was a song about running into an old flame who has moved on, gotten married, and is happy. The singer isn't angry. He's polite. He's gracious. He forces a smile and offers his congratulations while his heart is quietly breaking. The lyrics were a polite dagger to the heart. Gwen, congratulations. I see you've got a new love, and you're holding to him so tight. Gwen, congratulations. I guess I'm not invited to your wedding day tomorrow night. The production was pure Countrypolitan perfection. A gentle acoustic guitar intro, followed by Tommy's warm, empathetic vocal, all wrapped in a blanket of soaring strings and angelic backing singers. It was elegant, it was mature, and it struck a chord with millions. The song climbed to number 5 on the Billboard country charts. At 34 years old, after a lifetime of waiting, Tommy Overstreet was a star. Gwen set the template for what would become his signature style. Over the next decade, Tommy, now affectionately known as T.O., became one of the most consistent hit makers in country music. He racked up an incredible string of 11 consecutive top 10 hits, a feat few artists could claim. The titles themselves read like a list of lost loves and poignant goodbyes. And Don't Go Running, I Don't Know You Anymore, Jeannie Marie, You Were a Lady, and Heaven Is My Woman's Love. His songs were like miniature 3-act plays. They dealt with adult themes, divorce, infidelity, the quiet erosion of love, with a nuance and sensitivity that was often missing from the genre. In And Don't Go Running, he's not begging a woman to stay for his sake, but for the sake of their children. In I Don't Know You Anymore, he captures the devastating moment when you realize the person sleeping next to you has become a stranger. This wasn't the stuff of teenage fantasy. This was the reality of adult relationships set to music. His image was as carefully crafted as his sound. While Waylon and Willie were cultivating their outlaw personas with long hair, denim, and a defiant attitude, Tommy Overstreet was the picture of sophistication. He was always immaculately dressed in tailored suits with perfectly coiffed hair and a gentlemanly demeanor. He was selling a different kind of country masculinity, one that was stable, dependable, and sensitive. He was the man you could bring home to your parents. Even if his songs were about breaking your heart, the personal stories and anecdotes from this period paint a picture of a man who was deeply committed to his craft and his audience. He was known as a consummate professional, a tireless performer who treated every show, whether in a sold-out arena or a small-town fair, with the same level of respect. He wasn't a wild, unpredictable rock star. He was a working man, and his work was music. His wife, Diane, was a constant presence, a grounding force in the whirlwind of fame. They had a life away from the spotlight, a family, a sense of normalcy that was crucial for him. In interviews, Tommy often spoke not of the glitz and glamour, but of the connection he felt with the people who bought his records. One of the most revealing insights into his mindset comes from a quote he gave in a later interview. He said, "I always tried to find songs that I thought the average person on the street could relate to. The problems with love, the happiness of love, these are things everybody goes through." This was the core of his appeal. He wasn't singing at his audience. He felt like he was singing for them. He was their voice, articulating the complex, often unspoken emotions of everyday life. There's a beautiful rarely discussed story that perfectly encapsulates his connection to his fans. During a tour, he received a letter from a woman who was terminally ill. Her one wish was to see him perform. T.O. not only arranged for her to attend the show, but spent time with her backstage, talking with her and her family for over an hour. He didn't do it for publicity. In fact, it was kept quiet for years. He did it because he felt a genuine responsibility to the people whose lives he touched with his music. He understood that a song like Gwen wasn't just a hit record. For someone somewhere, it was the soundtrack to a real painful memory, and he treated that connection with a profound and gentle respect. He also never forgot the man who had cast such a long shadow over his life. He remained close with Gene Austin until Gene's death in 1974. By then, Tommy had established his own identity, his own success. He had finally stepped out of the shadow, not by rejecting it, but by honoring it and then forging his own path. He had proved that he wasn't just Gene Austin's cousin. He was Tommy Overstreet. But even at the height of his fame, Tommy Overstreet found himself at the center of a quiet controversy. It wasn't a scandal of drink or drugs, but a debate that cut to the very soul of country music. This was the Countrypolitan War. To the traditionalists, the sound that Tommy Overstreet and his contemporaries were perfecting was an abomination. They called it country pop, and they didn't mean it as a compliment. They felt the lush strings, the polished production, and the pop-leaning melodies were a betrayal of the genre's heritage. They saw it as music made by committee, designed in a Nashville boardroom to appeal to the widest possible audience, sacrificing authenticity in the process. The criticism was that it was rhinestone country, all flash and no substance. It was the sound of the city, not the country. This debate was fierce and often personal. It created deep divides between artists who had once shared the same stages. The Outlaws, with their raw, stripped-down sound, positioned themselves as the true heirs to the legacy of Hank Williams and Lefty Frizzle. They saw the Countrypolitan artists as sellouts, chasing pop chart glory at the expense of their roots. Where did Tommy Overstreet fit in all of this? He never engaged in the public feuds. He was by nature a gentleman, not a brawler. But his music was Exhibit A in the case against the Nashville sound. His records were the epitome of the style, sophisticated, smooth, and radio-friendly. However, to dismiss him as a mere pop singer in a cowboy hat is to profoundly misunderstand his artistry and the context of the time. Tommy Overstreet wasn't pretending to be something he wasn't. He wasn't a rough-and-tumble honky-tonker from a backwoods shack. He was a polished professional from a generation that valued presentation and craftsmanship. His music was an authentic reflection of his sensibility. The emotional core of his songs was pure country, themes of love, loss, and regret. What was different was the packaging. You could argue that artists like Tommy Overstreet were not diluting country music, but rather expanding its emotional vocabulary. They proved that a country song didn't need a crying steel guitar to convey deep sadness. The sorrow could be found in the swell of a cello section, the ache in a perfectly controlled vocal. His performance of a song like I Don't Know You Anymore is a masterclass in subtlety. There's no histrionic wailing, there's just the quiet, devastating resignation of a man watching his marriage die. It's a different kind of authenticity, the authenticity of quiet desperation, not rowdy rebellion. History has a way of being kinder in retrospect. Today, the Countrypolitan era is seen not as a betrayal, but as a vital and influential chapter in the genre's history. It was the bridge that carried country music from a niche, regional market into the national mainstream. Without the crossover success of artists like Tommy Overstreet, the global phenomenon that country music became in the 80s and 90s might never have happened. He and his peers were pioneers, proving that country music could be both commercially successful and emotionally resonant on a massive scale. The controversy wasn't about right or wrong. It was about two different, equally valid visions for what country music could be. Tommy Overstreet simply chose the path of velvet and strings over denim and grit. By the end of the 1970s, the musical tides began to turn once again. The slick Countrypolitan sound that had dominated the decade started to fall out of favor. The urban cowboy movement brought a new pop rock sheen to country, and the neo-traditionalist movement of the 80s, led by artists like George Strait and Randy Travis, would swing the pendulum back towards a more classic sound. For Tommy Overstreet, this meant his string of top 10 hits in the United States came to an end. The radio stations that had once played his songs on repeat were now making room for new sounds and new faces. For many artists, this would have been the end of the road, a slide into obscurity, playing oldies, shows in half-empty halls. But this is where Tommy Overstreet's story takes another surprising and revealing turn. While his star was fading in America, it was beginning to shine brightly on the other side of the Atlantic. T.O. found a massive and devoted following in Europe, particularly in the United Kingdom and Germany. The very qualities that were becoming unfashionable in Nashville, the pop-inflected melodies, the smooth production, the universal themes of love, made his music incredibly accessible to an international audience. He became a regular on European television shows and a headliner at major festivals. For years, he was a bigger star in Europe than he was at home. This chapter of his life speaks volumes about his resilience and his identity as a performer. He wasn't defined by the American charts. He was a musician, and he would go wherever the music was loved. He continued to tour and record, building a legacy that was quieter, but in many ways more global than that of some of his more famous contemporaries. So, what is the ultimate consequence of Tommy Overstreet's career? What is his historical significance? He wasn't a revolutionary like Willie Nelson or a titan like Johnny Cash. He didn't fundamentally change the direction of country music. His significance is more subtle, but no less important. First, he was a master of his craft, a perfecter of a specific and hugely influential subgenre. He stands as one of the finest exemplars of the Countrypolitan sound. To listen to his catalog is to hear that era in its most polished and emotionally potent form. He and producers like Billy Sherrill created a sound that defined a decade and bridged the gap between traditional country and mainstream pop. Second, his career demonstrates that there is more than one way to be an authentic artist. In an industry that often celebrates the rebel and the outlaw, Tommy Overstreet carved out a space for the gentleman. He proved that quiet dignity, professionalism, and emotional sensitivity were also valid expressions of the country music spirit. His life's work challenges the narrow definition of what a country star should be. And finally, his greatest legacy is the music itself, the songs. In an increasingly noisy and cynical world, his music offers a kind of refuge. It's a return to a time when a song could tell a complete story, when emotion was conveyed with grace and nuance. His hits like Gwen and Anne are more than just oldies. They are timeless snapshots of the human heart. They remind us that the most profound feelings, love, regret, acceptance, are often the quietest. He gave voice to the bittersweet moments that define our lives, and in doing so, he achieved a kind of immortality. He still matters because the feelings he sang about will always matter. In his later years, Tommy Overstreet settled in the beautiful, tranquil state of Oregon, far from the frantic pace of Nashville. He continued to perform occasionally, his voice still smooth, his gentlemanly charm intact. He lived a life largely out of the public eye, surrounded by his family. In 2015, After a period of illness, Tommy Overstreet passed away at his home. He was 78 years old. There was no massive public mourning, no 24-hour news cycle dedicated to his passing. It was, in a way, much like the man himself, quiet, dignified, and gentle. But for those who knew his music, it was the end of an era, the closing of a chapter. When we look back on the story of Tommy Overstreet, we see a man of quiet contradictions. The preacher's son who became a secular star. The cousin of a legend who had to forge his own identity. The Nashville insider who became an icon in Europe. The country singer whose music often sounded more like pop. He was never the loudest voice in the room, but he was often the most articulate. His life wasn't a story of meteoric highs and catastrophic lows. It was a story of steady, persistent craftsmanship, a story of a man who found his lane and drove it with elegance and integrity for decades. He didn't kick down doors, he opened them politely. He didn't scream his pain, he sang it softly, in a way that let you make it your own. In the grand, sprawling narrative of country music, Tommy Overstreet might not be the most dramatic chapter, but he is one of the most beautiful. His music is a gentle reminder that some of the deepest heartaches are nursed not in a noisy barroom, but in the quiet of our own hearts. He was the voice of the graceful goodbye, the smiling regret, the man who could congratulate you on your happiness, even as it cost him his own. And in that quiet, elegant sorrow, he found a truth that was more powerful than any outlaw anthem. He found the fragile, heartbreaking beauty of an ordinary life, and he turned it into art. That's a wrap for today's video. If you enjoyed it, smash that like button, drop us a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you'll never miss our new content. Thanks for watching.